My perception is that they see the goals that you would have as a non-enlightened person as trivial, and then post experience they see a lot of the shit that like materialism, capitalism type stuff as like, oh, look at this like idiot who's doesn't understand like how to be one with the fucking sun, moon, and
Yeah.
ground. Like, you know what I mean?
You
Like
see that
that's
in me now, Derek. Don't you notice that's in me sometimes? Like how
a
I
little
don't
bit.
pick up on some stuff like real fast when it's a business thing. I'm like late. I don't move on it. And then I tell you like I'm not driven by it. That's the effects of that, but bro, that's where that came from. But let's talk about Connor Murphy. Steve, tell me what is going on with Connor Murphy. I want to ask Steve because Derek has analyzed him already. But Steve, explain to me. You're from Holland, so what's going on with him?
So there's two ways you can approach life, right? And we all have our directions and our experimentation phases. So I experimented with recreational drugs when I was younger because I'm from Holland, and it's literally everywhere. You can't use steroids in Holland; it's very frowned upon. But weed and LSD and MDMA and all that stuff, no problem. No problem at all. Everybody, or at least the people that I used to talk with, everybody experimented to a certain extent. And I've done my fair share of experimentation in my younger years. And then there's a couple people who continue with that and fall off the bandwagon and turn into a guy like Connor Murphy, where everything is extreme and you can't even relate to it anymore. Now, I honestly think that, eating feces and drinking urine, that was a April Fool's joke.
Yeah,
well, you never know, dude. You never know.
No, you don't really
Connor,
know.
Probably no. But eating another man's semen, that's so far beyond me. I can't even begin to speculate how, why. And I've met some interesting people in my days.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. We got to comment on this. So, okay, I think that's more understandable than the excrement part. Because at least that could be hypersexuality from the just to be a little scientific. So I think you were saying that maybe he is not being serious about what he's saying. But the thing is, if you guys notice when he's talking to the camera, he is smiling ear to ear.
Oh, yeah, it freaks me out a bit, dude.
Yes. So he's just like,
there's a brain chemistry issue there. Yeah.
Yes. So what it
looks like somebody that's been mega dosing DMT, or
it
salvia.
Looks like the Joker. It looks like the Joker from Batman. Yeah. And it's like literally a guy who's went off the dopaminergic deep end where he's But I'm not making fun of him. But realistically, though, I mean it genuinely. What happens, just for the audience to know, is sometimes, I know we'll let Steve continue, but just for the audience to know scientifically, sometimes two things can do this to people often. One is like extreme changes in psychic states. So you can do a very intense mushroom trip or a very intense DMT trip, and that could be enough to dysregulate someone's dopamine. So there's a dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, and there's a dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder has an element of it called manic mania, which is what that smiling, that thing is in general. It's like mania, where the person is so upbeat and so optimistic and ambitious. Usually you see a lot of optimism, a lot of hopefulness for the future in these states. So this often happens with an individual psychedelic experience or a few of them, or extended high dopaminergic signaling from like amphetamines or cocaine or stuff like that. So I think that he was genuine. I think that he really believe that he's really in a dopaminergic state like that. And second of all, when you're in a highly dopaminergic state, you get hypersexualized, right?
Yeah.
So I think maybe there's an excuse that somewhat you're curious and maybe it has some nutrients in it. That's a good excuse.
His Instagram is now very tantric.
Is it really?
Half the pictures are like tantric postures. So what it reminds me of is that people that use a little bit too much recreational drugs and they completely destroyed their ego to the point they don't understand really what they're actually trying to portray. Like, it's okay to destroy your ego and humble yourself and put life into perspective, sort of say, with an occasional LSD or mushroom or DMT treatment. There's nothing wrong with that, ayahuasca. But you see that with the guys that do MDMA every weekend, they get mentally completely dysregulated, because their serotonin system is completely up and down. And it's the same with the guys that do ayahuasca or mushrooms or LSD or whatever psychedelic frequently. Their ego gets destroyed in the process, and a lot of guys they completely disconnect from life. And that's what I see with Connor. He's just completely disconnected. And in his brain, it's all makes sense. But for the rest of us who are not that disconnected or not that enlightened, it's basically the same path. Right?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs like nuke their fucking brains. Like now you could argue that they, like the outcome, and it's a good thing because they're, super spiritual now and blah, blah, blah. But clearly what was important to them before, they have like no drive anymore to do anything. Yeah. And it's like, they're just floating through life, lackadaisically apathetic about fucking everything, zero ambition anymore. It's just like, I'm one with the fucking ground, the sun, the moon, the whatever. Who cares about anything?
There's a couple guys in Thailand walking around like this right at this moment, completely very driven in the past, and then they do the recreationals and so this is the same with this pickup artist stuff, right? That we discussed, to get it out of your system before you meet the woman of your life. You get that out of your system, and it's the same with recreational drugs. You do that in your younger years when you kind of you lower your ego and you kind of process life's bigger questions. And then once you're a little bit older and you're financially secure, you got that out of your system, so you don't feel like diving headfirst into these psychedelics, and then you completely, break yourself apart and go in a completely different direction in life. Because when you're, a little bit older, you should focus on, security, financial security, and being there for your partner. And as basic as it sounds, you get your house, your car, and your partner and your dog, right? It does contribute to the quality of your life, and just falling that all apart and taking the psychedelics to be enlightened, you'll not get anywhere, because you'll burn through all your cash.
Yeah, that's what freaks me out about the like the Connor thing. The thing that freaks me out is seeing him, for example. Now it's like not just him that this has happened to, but people who I've seen who are like very entrepreneurial individuals, or guys who had a lot of drive to do something that they felt was, they were building some sort of empire for themselves, and then they just like don't give a fuck at all anymore, it seems, afterwards. Now maybe
did they reach their financial goals, where they're self-made millionaires, or they didn't reach that point?
Well, like Connor definitely was successful, but there's no way he like fully capitalized on what he could have. Like he was very, very young when he reached like a hyper accelerated peak, and like he could have gone way further with it if he really wanted to, but then I guess he got into the spirituality stuff. And this is, I've just seen generally with a lot of different people this happened to. So it's kind of like overall freaked me out of ever trying psychedelics personally. Now, maybe that's like the bad, the number one examples of a bad reaction potentially. So maybe it's like, I'm sure anyone who's tried it and has had good experiences would say they're not the representatives of what this stuff can do. But at the same time, it's like, do I really want to risk fucking with my brain chemistry? Even though we literally do that for biohacking, but I mean, like, to this degree where you're a totally different human essentially afterwards, I'm like,
use and abuse, it's different. There's use where you intermittently use a recreational drug for enjoyment or escape. I mean, I won't lie. I mean, most of my drug use was escapism when I was younger, and parents going through divorces and you're like, okay, I need a break, and you use some recreational drugs to kind of get away from it all. That many people do, and there's nothing wrong with that unless you spiral into addiction. Now, if you use it intermittently for a specific purpose, there's nothing wrong with that at any stage of life. But it's this frequent and consistent and again, the escapism that turns into abuse or addiction, that's where the issues lie. So I wonder, for some of your friends, Derek, maybe they reached all their financial goals and they got a lot of pressure and they worked their ass off, right? And then at one point they're like, okay, I'm satisfied with what I've accomplished, and now I'm going to relax. And then again, since they didn't do that in their younger years, that spirals into frequent use to the point that they get personality changes. I've seen that happen many times also around me as well. And I think people need to pull themselves back in all aspects, whether that's bodybuilding, financially driven, relationships, and balance. I know it's very difficult and annoying to say, but if you can balance all aspects of life, you never overdo one of them, but you never underperform either.
Leo, so you don't see
this stays. I have an afro now. It just like any place position anyway. Yeah. So what are you saying?
So you don't see considering you're like a gut microbiome guy, you don't see any efficacy in the fecal transplants?
Oh wait, we have so much to talk about the addiction thing though, briefly. But
Oh,
about
well,
the
that's
fecal
like about the Connor Murphy
no, no, no,
eating
no,
his
yeah.
shit thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not that I don't see it. So the idea of the fecal transplants, right, is to introduce bacteria actually into the microbiome in the hopes that the bacteria will live on its own or repopulate the microbiome. But I haven't looked into research of the fecal transplants, but what I know from the probiotic research is that it's never long lasting. So if you supplement probiotics, it goes away after 3 months because, and also what I know from genetic research is that there's genetic polymorphisms that are associated with the variety of bacteria we have, the volume of it, and so on, and several polymorphisms, not just one. So I think a lot of things, I think there's a homeostasis that will occur. So I don't want to keep.
It's not sustainable like a probiotic supplementation regimen could be.
Unless you want to put people's stuff up your stuff every day, as you said, put people's shit up your shit.
But the fecal transplant.
So funny, by the way. I replayed that one. Really.
I met people who had to do that because they traveled through India or Indonesia, where their gut microbiome got completely destroyed, and they had to do a fecal transplant, and it's a process that takes a year or longer, and they have tablets, and then you have to select 1 or 2 individuals that you're going to use this fecal transplant from.
Yeah, like you wouldn't use your own, which is the thing that made no
because
sense.
it's messed up. No, so the only animal that does that is rodents.
Imagine the person who didn't get it, who has an autoimmune condition, who's sitting at home trying that out themselves, putting it back in. Anyway.
No, you need it from somebody else who's healthy, That's the only reason why you would do it.
How do you select the person is the question. Who is this person? You're like, would you give me one of the, I want to put it in me. Anyway.
I know a person who got that requested from him. He has got awesome genetics. And he stays lean year round and doesn't lose any size. And somebody requested him for a fecal transplant. Offered him money. Sorry? No. A local guy in Thailand. He's the genetics out of his ass. It's unbelievable. And somebody offered him. Said,
I thought that's what you meant by the. I was just guessing the genetic phenom that you knew.
No. At least Joe has to put in the work. He's 2 hours per cardio per day. He's putting in the work. But this other guy is lean year round and doesn't lose any size when he goes on cycle. So he doesn't do PCT. He just goes on cycle, gains size, comes off, doesn't lose any size, doesn't look any different. I see the blood work. He's clearly off cycle. And then he goes on cycle again and gains another 2 or 3 kilos on a cycle that doesn't make any sense. So he got offered, somebody said, give me your stool.
That's an interesting response to that, by the way. Yeah. You're like, oh, this guy has great genetics for getting mass. Give me your bacteria. That's of all things, But people also, desperate, just for people to know, like honestly, sometimes when I hear that, I'm like, oh wow, what great genetics. But at the same time, in my mind, I'm thinking, I would never really want that because I'd be scared. If you're growing that easily, what else is growing in your body? I'd rather have a harder time to grow, but then when I try and make sure nothing grows, nothing grows.
Everything, because as soon as you put these guys in growth hormone, their stomach starts protruding.
That's a sign that they have good IGF-1 receptivity. Okay, so wait, back to this drug issue so we don't forget. So I just wanted to mention, so I have some opinions on this. So the psychedelic experiences, I want to ask you guys, who do you think are the people who benefit the most from those subjective single experiences? Like Derek, even though you haven't tried it yourself, but you've heard of people like these entrepreneurs that you're talking about. Which of them had this is how you usually see it. You see a guy who will be, this is my experience. It'll usually be a guy who didn't party a lot in undergrad or whatever, didn't go out a lot, and was stuck in his ways, very focused, or her ways, and is a person that isn't very flexible. Is a person that's sort of stuck in their ways, and a person maybe that didn't experience all the things outside themselves or outside their own lifestyle. Those people I tend to notice have potentially profound experiences, trying mushrooms once or something like that. But when they do have profound experiences that change their lives, they usually don't go use it every 3 months afterwards. Then you'll meet people that, like myself, have had all kinds of experiences in life, but we'll try a psychedelic because other people have doing it, and then we'll say they love it and then do it every month. Like we've seen a bunch of people that like they tried DMT once, and then 8 months later you met him, and he's like, "Oh, I've done DMT 8 times." And you're like, "You do it every month? What's the purpose of that?" So what have you guys seen about that?
Like personally, above and beyond what I mentioned, and a lot of these aren't necessarily personal friends. It's just people I've observed, even on like YouTube, and watched their personalities totally change from when they used to make videos and like what they were doing with their life when they prior to these experiences, and then after, and like totally dissociating themselves from their driven passions beforehand and just being like, monk, spiritual guy afterwards, and like not really giving a fuck about anything, at least seemingly to me, to my like, trivial, non-enlightened
No,
passions,
it's
I
not
guess.
trivial. It's not trivial. I've actually been there, and that's what it feels like. It feels like that. You lose. You're totally on point. And if anyone in the comment section has tried psychedelics and is going to say he's not on point, I've tried them a lot, and it's happened to me before. I lost ambition for years.
But I mean, like, my perception is that they see the goals that you would have as a non-enlightened person as trivial, and then post experience they see a lot of the shit that like materialism, capitalism type stuff as like, oh, look at this like idiot who's doesn't understand like how to be one with the fucking sun, moon, and ground. Like, you know what I mean?
You
like,
see that in me now, Derek. Don't you notice that's in me sometimes? Like how I don't pick up on some stuff like real fast when it's a business thing. I'm like late. I don't move on it. And then I tell you like I'm not driven by it. That's the effects of that, but bro, that's where that came from years of that. That's where it came from. There were periods of that's how I lost my interest in the material world and my ego and stuff like that. But there's the thing, like Steve was saying, the total ego destruction, it's debilitating. You lose your sense of self. You can, maybe Derek, you can't imagine this, but Steve, I'm sure you've experienced this maybe sometime when you're using a lot of it. You start to be so compassionate of others and so at one with the universe that you don't have a sense of self. Like people can just bully you around. You just go along with it because you want to be kind. And then you don't take control of your life. So there's, like Steve was saying, there has to be a balance. Sorry, I will let you continue, but there has to be a balance between the ego. It's not overwhelming, but it can't be dead. Otherwise, you don't exist. You're dead.
In terms of the materialism thing too. Sorry, I'm just gonna like finish off my point before you go, Steve. But it's like the thing that I realized too is, so it seems to disconnect you. Like, again, I've never done it, so I can't fucking say it, but it seems like you start to care less about things that are seen as trivial, like, materialistic type behaviors, which I've noticed, Leo, you're like, you don't really give a fuck about that kind of stuff anymore. Whereas personally, I'm like, in my head, a lot of my objectives, I still have a lot of financial motivation. I still have a lot of stuff that's like very goal oriented with like obtain this, get this, do this to achieve this. And I think in a way, like that's, great that you can not feel dependence for your value based upon, random shit that you get. But at the same time, when you're trying to build companies, that the overarching goal of the company is to help people, like for example, in healthcare, like, am I going to be as driven to make a shit ton of money, which will also indirectly help a bunch of people in healthcare through, my clinic and how I'm going to expand it and whatnot? If I had this ego death thing, like, I feel like I probably wouldn't. So indirectly, even though enlightened Derek would give a less of a fuck about maybe like a cool car and like stuff like this, at the same time, I feel like my business would suffer that otherwise helps a shit ton of people. So I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's again, I was exposed to this drug culture very, very young. And, I would always hang out with older people. So they would, maybe 18, 19 years old when I was 16 or 15 years old. So they would already be the cool kids, right? And, do some recreational drugs. And then you see with frequent use, people would lose motivation. They would not go to school or go work. And their overall ambition has been degraded, partially because of the ego death. With psychedelics, with the guys that would use stimulants, they would just, go balls deep and still continue. There's a lot of cocaine abuse in, consultancy and, in those kind of fields, because you have to meet deadlines, right? So I've been exposed to that for a long time. I never partook to that extent. I would always use it intermittently for a specific reason, whether that was to escape for a certain period of time, or because I wanted to put my life into perspective and take a step back. Like, let's say you put all your problems on ground level, and then you would take an elevator to the 40th floor and observe. right? That will basically be an LSD trip or a mushroom trip. And then you would come back down to ground level and all your problems would be put in perspective and you carry on, right? So I never lost financial incentive or drive, but it could be that my overall ambition have been taken a step back because I don't want the stress that comes along with this super high ambition. And that's one of the reasons why I took so many people out of my life. So that's why I moved away from Holland, right? I don't want particular things in my life. And I completely changed my surroundings to get everything to what I want from my life. Right? And a little bit of ego death occurred and a little bit of manipulating of these surroundings occurred. That's why I told, Derek said, hey, travel a little bit because you can't, there's certain things you can't accomplish from behind your computer screen, travel, see the world a little bit. And now would be a perfect time. Like, and I already got that out of my system because traveling changed me as a person, even though I already, did a psychedelic trip, prior. And there's several things that can form you as a person and that might take away some of your ambition because, what I see also from people that were very driven at my age back then when I was 26, below 30, then they get into this overcompensation state later in life because they missed out on other aspects that they wanted to do. And then the sports car comes into play or the
That's when it may
recreational
be
drug.
useful. That's when it may be.
So it's very difficult to kind of come up with a good trajectory on how to approach it because not everybody benefits from taking recreational drugs. And the people who do benefit, you have to reel them back also because the ego gets down and then you have to reel them back into the abuse where people spiral into, frequent use. That's also not the right approach. And trust me, I've seen all these guys around me spiral into drug abuse at one point or another.
So there's a brain connectivity network that actualizes the sense of self. And it seems this network can be broken up through the plasticity and change in connectivity in the brain during those psychic shifts. So that may be what is actually physically happening with the death of the ego. But what Derek was referring to, this loss of ambition, is a downregulation of dopamine receptors specifically. And this will happen to anyone that's not using a highly dopaminergic drug. So even if someone is using an opiate at a high dose, eventually they lose interest. So it doesn't have to be just a psychedelic.
But
so two things will happen
with frequent use, whereas you would use it maybe once a year.
Let's get into that. Let's get into that. Exactly. So I wanted to bring up that topic. So what do you think about this, Steve? What do you think of in Holland? I don't know if Holland has a drinking culture, but Europe in general has a drinking culture. So usually you'll see that on the weekends, at least, people will go drinking a little bit, or usually in England, even on the weekdays, people go to the pub. What I would notice is this: when I worked in finance, is that the people who would go partying on the weekend tended to be a little bit less upbeat on the weekdays at work. They tended to be a little bit less. When they come in the morning, they're not smiling like we are. They don't come and network and say hi to everybody with the same energy. They come in a little bit like, and the day has to get started. And their dopamine is dysregulated. Normally, dopamine should peak in the morning. But if you go and burst it off on the weekend, it seems a little dysregulated.
I don't know. Hangover and missing meals in the weekend.
No, because they do it all week. They're never the same level of the people that are totally teetotalers. The people that they're always on the same level of, because imagine the difference is also beyond that. Think of this, Steve, too, right? Which is something that Derek brought up, which is this idea that, right, you, Derek, want to change the outside world because there's something within you that you don't like. And instead of going and taking a drug and sitting in a closed room and hitting the drug till you make yourself happy about the world, whatever, which is really a lot of what drug taking is taking control of your actual, instead of trying to change the world like Derek is and being fundamental, like, okay, I don't like this or I want to improve this, I'm going to go do it. Instead of doing that, once you take this element of, I can control my happiness with this little drug that I really like at home, when it's not a psychedelic, when it's like, it could even be marijuana, that will just change your whole perception of the world, because now you don't have to rely on changes in the exterior world to get that dopamine boost. You can just do it yourself. Everything's out of perspective.
Ambition is really zero. So, I do know people who take it intermittently again, and then use that experience to change their surroundings and their trajectory in life. So I want a little bit more in this aspect, and they take action. And maybe it's this, experience that they had that allowed them to open up. Like when I had an LSD trip, I realized I can't live in Holland. Nothing here is is suitable for what I want out of my life. So I took a couple of years, but I changed my surroundings. So it led me in a positive direction. And now I live in a perfect place where 99% of what I want out of my life I can find here. And I've traveled all over the world, so and so I put it into practice. But a lot of people, they just use it as an escape, day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out. And the ambition and the ego and the aspirations are completely gone. And they just cruise along. They just drift. They just drift through life. And that's basically addiction,
I mean, if I think about it, like looking back, Derek, now I didn't know you never tried psychedelics. So like, it's interesting to talk to you from that perspective. Looking back, I used to think for many years after I developed that ego death, which really hurt me actually. Like it was not a pleasant feeling, to be honest with you, after a while. But after I did that for a while, I started to think that overall, I thought drugs took more out of me than I got out of them. I still think that, to be honest with you. And so I don't necessarily, not drugs. I'm talking about hedonistic drugs only. I'm not talking about drugs in general. But hedonistic drugs, I don't believe that they're very useful. And I think that most people would be fine without the psychedelic stuff. But I have to admit something. Like, even though, like, so what you're talking about, like, somebody goes through life and then they get a midlife crisis because they realize maybe what they were doing, they didn't want to live. Or Steve, you were living in Holland and then you had that experience. You realize, I don't want to live in Holland. And if you didn't have that experience, maybe at 40, you would have realized that, but it'd be too late, right? So a similar thing happened to me in a way. It's similar. When I was 21, I did a really heavy psychedelic trip, and I was at the time a religious person, and I followed a certain religion dogmatically. I would prayed 5 times a day, and I was sort of trapped in the religion because I couldn't stop believing in it, even though some things didn't make sense to me. I'm like a very loyal person, and I had this. I believed in the religion. I couldn't get out of it. One night, I did this trip. And I believed in it completely, but when I did the trip, I realized something in the text of the religion that was contradictory, self-contradictory. And this thing hit me, and I literally sat, I remember at 2 a.m, and wrote it on a piece of paper so I wouldn't forget. I wrote down, there's this phrase, these two are incompatible. One phrase says, God is all merciful, all forgiving. And the other phrase says, there is an eternal hellfire. Well, my knowledge of mathematics tells me if there's an infinite punishment, you can never be considered infinitely good because the infinite negative, that doesn't work. So that's illogical. That was enough for me. Then once I got past that, I was like, oh, wow, this thing is actually, and I don't want to offend anyone, but I thought it was not true. And that just changed my life. Now it hurt me and it threw me through some emotional turbulence, but I came out. Now I believe in God and I pray and everything, but I do it in a realistic fashion. And I don't believe in some things that I now think were not true. And so it helped me get out of myself enough to be able to do that. So I thought I'd show you a personal story.
Overall, these experiences contribute to you forming as a person. Just if you want to be a full person, you have to experience the broad perspective of it. But there's limitations to that, where you start eating feces and another man's semen. That would be like the bar. That there's a limit. You should set a limit for yourself.
But there's a limit beyond that, which is, we should just mention one last caveat for the audience. The reason why you have to be so careful about using psychedelics, like Derek said, is because there is a chance that you have a break and then you never go back to normal. So just to tell from personal experience, I had a very close friend in high school. He's Canadian, actually, Derek. I may have mentioned him to you before. And we went to college, and everybody in college, the first semester from high school, because we lived in Dubai, there's no marijuana in Dubai. So when they went to the US, to Canada and North America, the first semester, everyone wants to smoke weed. This was 2006, and weed was very exciting and stuff. So everybody smoked weed, everybody's normal, except me. I wasn't smoking weed. But 4 or 5 months down the line, my friend, one of the guys out of the whole group, so out of 12 guys, one of them went, he says bipolar, I'm not sure, but he went manic, and then he became bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. But for the next years, he had to drop out. He couldn't talk to us. I would go meet him, it would break my heart, bro. I would be talking to him and he was not there. He could not be there. And then if they would take him off the tranquilizers, he would get in a manic state. But instead of Connor being about feces and stuff, he was about politics. And he would get really into politics, but he wouldn't make sense. You would see that he was just so upbeat and not making sense, getting lost. And the misery and the pain he felt. And bro, all of it was because for a few months, he played with mushrooms and weed a little bit. He didn't know that he had a GABAergic deficiency. He, like me, was a naturally on edge person in high school. Years later, I come across papers that hypothesize that maybe people with naturally low inhibition, people naturally on edge, are more prone to these singular events that could destroy them forever. And by the way, years later, he just went back to college at the late 20s, finally finished the degree, and just got a job. And poor guy, he's just getting his life back together. It's been 8 years. So that can happen to you guys.
I met many people like this. And
really?
I don't keep it. Yeah, in Holland, all these guys experiment a little bit, but they experiment way too long and too much. And so again, there's use and abuse, and there's nothing wrong with occasionally drinking some alcohol or taking some other recreational drugs. But if it spirals into daily use, and that's what people, performance enhancing drugs are basically the same thing. You're always on PEDs. And you're just exchanging one for the other, and you're constantly on biohacking. And it takes its toll also, to the point you have to go back to physiological amounts. Yeah. I think there's just a limited amount of things you can do with your body until it starts to break. And so you can use it for certain aspects, but if it spirals into frequent use, there's a price to pay, basically.
So we should also mention, just for the audience, if people ever do use a psychedelic, especially LSD, DMT, mushrooms, and you want to potentially inhibit the risk a little bit, have somebody with you that has a 5-HT2 antagonist, a dopamine antagonist, and a beta blocker. Those are the three things you need to inhibit. If you get into a point where your paranoia is very high, you need to take something like Seroquel under doctor's supervision, who's sitting with you, like 200, 300 milligrams of Seroquel, which will block the 5-HT2C and the dopamine receptors and slow down. Because I believe the level of paranoia and the level of excitement, that's when the break happens. That combined with the plasticity, that's when the break happens. So you want to immediately block it if it gets too bad. It should never be terrifying.
Yeah, and you should go in with a good state of mind.
Good state of mind. You have to be very good mood. You never do that even with alcohol, by the way. If you have a very bad day and you go drinking, sometimes you'll be angry while drunk. You're not angry, but not in a good mood.
I knew that since I was 14 years old, that you shouldn't do that, because you see that around you. Yeah, but it's with every recreational drug. You should go in there with a clear state of mind and being sound. But a lot of people are not, whether that even anxiety, if you're experiencing anxiety or you have episodes of anxiety, you should not use recreational drugs, even for escapism, because it will just exacerbate, and again, recreational drugs don't solve anything, but you can maybe learn something, whether that's through ego death or putting your life into perspective by taking a step out of it. And you can accomplish the same thing by just going to a rooftop bar and just observing the world from the 50th floor, and just all my problems are there, and you escape that way. You have a nice martini, and really, but maybe it's because I can compare it to doing psychedelics in the past.
We're talking about psychedelics, and then let's talk now also about recreational drugs in general. So like opiates.
Do you guys mind if I go to the bathroom real quick, because this coffee is so please continue with that. Sorry,
Leo. You can tell me about the dulaglutide you've been using while we're waiting.
Dulaglutide.
We already know Steve's experience with the GLPs, but now yours.
Exactly. Well, I wanted to follow Steve's advice and get the short-acting one, because obviously it makes much more sense. The short-acting one should have less side effects. But as you know, I had to negotiate with the nurse. So the nurse, the nurse informed me that